In the spring of 1861, in a small mill town 40 miles from Boston, a 6-year-old boy spoke secrets that no one should know. Thomas Merrick had been mute for 6 weeks after arriving at St. Bartholomew's charity home. Then, without warning, he began describing the final moments of a man's death, a drowning that happened 3 miles away, witnessed by no one, with details so precise they could only have come from the victim himself. But Thomas had never left the orphanage. The dead man had never visited, and the boy's knowledge extended far beyond one death. He knew about stillbirths, deathbed confessions, and words spoken in locked rooms with no witnesses. The town physician, Dr. Samuel Carr, was given 48 hours to provide a medical explanation, or the boy would be sent to the state asylum. What Dr. Carr discovered in the church basement would reveal something far worse than the supernatural. Hidden among the confession letters and telegraph slips was evidence of a network, one that had been operating for years, turning orphan children into tools and selling them to the highest bidder. How many trusted adults does it take to transform a child's trauma into profit? We invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this documentary. We are interested to know where these documented accounts reach. If this search for truth matters to you, subscribe and stand with us. The visitor log lay open on the narrow desk in the front hall of St. Bartholomew's charity home, its pages crowded with notations in careful script. The entry for the 14th of March, 1861, recorded in black ink at 15 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, read: Reverend Ashford requests Dr. Carr attend regarding the boy Thomas. Third incident. Parish Council convenes Friday to discuss removal or remedy. Matter of utmost discretion advised. Beneath this, the signature of E. Whitmore, matron, appeared in the same steady hand that had documented every visitor, every delivery, every departure from the institution for the past 3 years. Dr. Samuel Carr read the notation twice before looking up at the woman who had summoned him. Eugenia Whitmore stood with her hands clasped at her waist, her posture suggesting both propriety and unease. The hallway smelled of lye soap and boiled potatoes. Somewhere above, children's voices echoed through the floorboards, muffled by distance, and the thick plaster walls of the converted merchant's house that now served as the town's orphanage. The third incident, Dr. Carr said. I was not informed of the first two. Reverend Ashford felt it prudent to observe before troubling you, Matron Whitmore replied. But yesterday's episode has forced his hand. The parish council has taken notice. Millbrook, Massachusetts, in the spring of 1861, was a town of 1,847 souls, most of whom derived their livelihood from the textile mill that dominated the eastern bank of the Coldwater River. The nation itself was fracturing. Fort Sumter would fall within a month, though no one in Millbrook yet understood what that would mean for the sons who worked the looms or the fathers who owned them. Local tensions ran along similar fault lines. The mill owners, with their unionist sympathies, distrusted the church authorities, several of whom had made their southern leanings known in Sunday sermons. St. Bartholomew's existed in this precarious space, funded by parish donations and an anonymous charitable trust that no one questioned too closely. Dr. Carr had been the town's physician for 11 years. He was 43 years old, methodical in habit, skeptical by training, and recently widowed. His wife, Sarah, had died in childbirth the previous spring, taking their stillborn daughter with her. Since then, he had thrown himself into his work with a rigor that some found admirable and others found unsettling. He kept detailed case notes. He favored empirical observation over speculation. He did not attend church. Tell me what happened, he said. Matron Whitmore led him through the hall and up the narrow stairs to the children's dormitory. 14 beds lined the walls, 7 to each side, each covered with a thin wool blanket. The room was cold despite the season. Thomas Merrick sat on the edge of the fourth bed on the left, a small boy with dark hair and hollow cheeks, wearing a shirt too large for his frame and trousers that had been mended at the knees. He did not look up when they entered. "Thomas arrived here in January," Matron Whitmore said quietly. "Transferred from the Boston Foundling Hospital after his mother's death. Typhoid in the prison ward. The boy was mute for the first 6 weeks. We assumed trauma. Then, on the 12th of March, during evening meal, he spoke for the first time." Dr. Carr knelt beside the bed, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. Thomas's gaze remained fixed on the floorboards. His hands rested in his lap, perfectly still. "What did he say?" Dr. Carr asked. Matron Whitmore's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He said, 'Mr. Hewitt didn't mean to. The ice cracked and the water was so cold it burned. He called for Margaret 3 times before the black came. He said he was sorry about the money.'" Dr. Carr felt something cold move through his chest. Silas Hewitt, foreman at the mill, had drowned at Coldwater Pond on the 28th of February. His body had been found by hunters 4 days later, tangled in the roots of a fallen oak beneath the ice. The death had been ruled accidental. Margaret Hewitt was his widow, and there was talk, quiet talk, of 40 pounds missing from the mill accounts, though only the executor and the widow were supposed to know. "The boy has never left this building since his arrival," Matron Whitmore continued. "Mr. Hewitt never visited. There is no way Thomas could have known these details. Yet he described them precisely, down to the number of times Mr. Hewitt called his wife's name." Dr. Carr studied the child's face. No fever, no signs of injury. The pupils were equal and reactive. The boy breathed evenly, showed no tremor in his hands, exhibited none of the physical markers of laudanum or other tinctures. "You mentioned earlier incidents," Dr. Carr said. Matron Whitmore hesitated, then nodded. "On the 2nd of February, Thomas described Mrs. Good's stillbirth. He mentioned the call. No one outside the family knew that detail. On the 18th of February, he recited words from Mr. Fletcher's deathbed, words that had been spoken only to Mr. Fletcher's daughter, in a closed room, with no other witnesses present." Dr. Carr rose slowly to his feet. His training offered several possible explanations: overheard conversations, servants gossiping within earshot of a child no one believed was listening, coaching, though to what purpose remained unclear, trauma-induced fugue states, cryptomnesia, the phenomenon of forgotten memories, surfacing as apparent revelations. But each explanation felt insufficient when measured against the specificity of what the boy had said. "I will need to examine him more thoroughly," Dr. Carr said, "and I will need access to your records, admission documents, visitor logs, any correspondence related to Thomas's transfer from Boston." "Reverend Ashford has asked that you provide a medical explanation by Friday," Matron Whitmore said. "The parish council meets that evening. If you cannot assure them this is a medical matter, they intend to transfer Thomas to the state asylum for treatment." Dr. Carr was about to respond when the boy spoke. His voice was clear and soft, without inflection, as though reciting something memorized long ago. "Dr. Carr, your Sarah wants you to know the roses weren't your fault. She said the baby wasn't meant for this world. She said you did everything right." The room seemed to contract. Dr. Carr stood motionless, staring at the child who still would not meet his eyes. Sarah, the roses, the hothouse roses he had bought in a moment of extravagance, an indulgence he had felt guilty about, even as he placed them beside her bed. The baby wasn't meant for this world. Sarah's exact words, whispered to him in their bedroom 11 months ago, with no other living soul present to hear them. Matron Whitmore's face had gone pale. She touched Dr. Carr's elbow, but he did not move. The boy remained perfectly still, his small hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed on something neither of the adults could see. Dr. Carr returned to St. Bartholomew's at first light on the 15th of March, carrying his medical bag and a notebook bound in brown leather. He had not slept. The boy's words had followed him through the dark hours, circling his mind with the persistence of a fever that would not break. Your Sarah wants you to know the roses weren't your fault. He had told no one about the roses. He had spoken those words to no one. Yet somehow they had emerged from the mouth of a 6-year-old child who had never met his wife, never entered his home, never existed in any sphere of his life until yesterday afternoon. Matron Whitmore met him in the front hall and led him to her office, a cramped room at the rear of the building that smelled of ink and old paper. A single window overlooked the narrow yard where the older children sometimes played. The matron's desk was orderly, every ledger and folder aligned with geometric precision. She produced the orphanage admission records without being asked, 3 bound volumes covering the years 1858 through 1861. Dr. Carr opened the most recent volume and began to read. 23 children had been admitted to St. Bartholomew's during this period. 14 remained in residence. 6 had been transferred to what the ledger described as affiliated institutions, though no addresses were listed beside these notations. 3 had died. The causes of death were recorded as pneumonia, scarlet fever, and drowning. There were no entries documenting family inquiries. There were no discharge papers filed for any of the transferred children. The affiliated institutions, Dr. Carr said. Where are they located? Matron Whitmore folded her hands on the desk. Reverend Ashford handles those arrangements. I am not privy to the details. And the families of the transferred children. Do they write? Do they visit? These are orphans, Dr. Carr. Most have no families to speak of. He turned back to the ledger, running his finger down the column of names. The penmanship was Matron Whitmore's, the same steady script that appeared in the visitor log. Beside each name was an age, a date of admission, and a brief notation of origin. Boston Foundling Hospital appeared 6 times. Springfield Charity Ward appeared 3 times. 2 children had been surrendered directly by destitute parents. The rest had been found abandoned or orphaned by disease. Thomas Merrick's entry occupied the bottom third of page 47. Male, age 6, admitted January 19, 1861, transferred from Boston Foundling Hospital following mother's death. A separate document had been clipped to the page, a letter on Boston Foundling Hospital stationery dated January 16th. Dr. Carr unfolded it carefully. Thomas Merrick, male, age 6 approximately, admitted June 1860 following mother's arrest. Mother deceased January 1861. Typhoid, prison ward. Boy presents with selective mutism. Notable: boy was present during mother's employment at Tremont House Hotel 1858 through 60. Recommend isolation from stimulating environments. Tremont House. Dr. Carr had stayed there twice on visits to Boston. It was the city's grandest hotel, a place where wealthy travelers lodged, where business was conducted in leather armchairs, where secrets were as common as cigars and brandy. Thomas's mother had worked there for 2 years. What had she done? Cleaned rooms, served meals. And what had the boy witnessed during those years? Moving through corridors where men spoke freely, assuming a servant's child was deaf to their conversations. I need to speak with Thomas again, Dr. Carr said. Alone, if possible. Matron Whitmore's expression tightened. Reverend Ashford has requested that any interactions with the boy take place under supervision. For the child's protection. Protection from what? From further agitation. The episodes are distressing for him. Dr. Carr closed the ledger. Have you witnessed these episodes yourself? Yes. 2 or 3 times each week, always during evening meal. The boy becomes very still. His eyes lose focus. Then he speaks in a voice that does not sound entirely his own. Different mannerisms, different cadences, as though he were inhabited by something outside himself. The language was careful, almost clinical, but Dr. Carr heard the suggestion beneath it. Spiritualism had enjoyed tremendous popularity in recent years. The Fox sisters had made a fortune, claiming to communicate with the dead through mysterious rappings and utterances. Seances were conducted in parlors across New England. The grieving paid handsomely for any promise of contact with lost loved ones. But Dr. Carr had attended one such seance in Boston 3 years ago, and he had left convinced that what he had witnessed was theater, not transcendence. "When did these episodes begin?" he asked. Matron Whitmore hesitated. Shortly after Reverend Ashford began private prayer sessions with Thomas. The Reverend felt the boy needed spiritual guidance to overcome his mutism. He meets with Thomas twice weekly in the church basement. The sessions are conducted alone, as the Reverend believes the boy responds better without the distraction of others present. Something cold settled in Dr. Carr's chest. "How long have these prayer sessions been taking place?" "Since late January, perhaps 5 weeks." 5 weeks. Thomas had arrived at St. Bartholomew's in mid-January. Within days, Reverend Ashford had begun private sessions with him. Within weeks, the boy had started speaking revelations about the recently dead. The correlation was impossible to ignore, yet its meaning remained unclear. Was Ashford coaching the boy? If so, how was he obtaining information that should have been private, even sacred? Deathbed confessions, final words spoken only to family. The intimate details of drownings and stillbirths and last breaths. Dr. Carr stood. "I will return this evening. I want to observe Thomas during one of these episodes." "The parish council meets Friday," Matron Whitmore reminded him. "You have less than 2 days." He left the orphanage and walked through the morning streets of Millbrook, past the mill where looms already clattered behind tall windows, past the church with its white steeple rising against a gray sky. His mind worked through the possibilities with the same methodical precision he applied to diagnosing pneumonia or setting a fractured bone. Supernatural explanations required abandoning everything he understood about the natural world. Coaching required a source of information that seemed impossible to obtain. Medical explanations required symptoms the boy did not exhibit. Yet one fact remained inescapable. Thomas Merrick knew things he should not know. That afternoon, Dr. Carr received an unexpected visitor. James Hewitt, son of the drowned foreman, appeared at his door shortly after 3 o'clock. He was 26 years old, educated in Boston, training to practice law. His father's death had brought him back to Millbrook. His face was drawn, his eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness or grief, or both. "I heard about the boy," James Hewitt said without preamble. "I heard what he said about my father." Dr. Carr invited him inside. They sat in the front room where Dr. Carr met with patients. The younger man's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "My father's death was ruled accidental, but there were irregularities in the mill accounts, 40 pounds missing. My mother accepted the church's explanation that it was a tragic mishap, that my father had gone walking on the pond, and the ice gave way. But if that boy knew details about my father's final moments, if he knew my father spoke about money, then perhaps his death was not accidental at all." Dr. Carr measured his words carefully. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that someone may have information about my father's death that has not been shared with the proper authorities. And I am suggesting that if you are investigating this boy, I want to help." The two men looked at each other across the small room. Outside, the light was already fading. Friday approached with the inevitability of a closing door. Whatever Thomas Merrick was, whatever explained his impossible knowledge, the answer lay somewhere in the intersection of deathbed confessions and private prayer sessions and children who disappeared into affiliated institutions that kept no addresses. Dr. Carr did not yet understand the pattern, but he understood that James Hewitt's grief had just become an asset in an investigation neither of them had agreed to undertake. "Meet me at the church tonight," Dr. Carr said. 11 o'clock. Bring a lantern." The church stood dark against the night sky when Dr. Carr and James Hewitt approached it shortly before 11 o'clock on the evening of the 15th of March. Clouds obscured the moon. The only light came from the covered lantern Hewitt carried, its glow barely sufficient to illuminate the path between the gravestones that surrounded the building. The church itself was a simple structure of white painted wood, built 30 years earlier when Millbrook had been half its current size. A separate entrance at the rear led down to the basement where the parish stored hymnals and communion vessels and records too old to warrant space in the rectory. The door was locked. Dr. Carr had anticipated this. He produced a thin metal instrument from his medical bag, a tool he had once used to open a locked medicine cabinet during an emergency call. The mechanism yielded after several minutes of careful manipulation. The two men descended a narrow staircase into darkness that smelled of damp stone and old paper. Hewitt uncovered the lantern. Yellow light spread across a low-ceilinged room lined with wooden shelves. Hymnals occupied the shelves nearest the stairs, their leather spines arranged by year. Communion silver sat locked in a glass-fronted cabinet. A desk stood against the far wall, its surface bare except for a single candlestick. But it was the tall cabinet beside the desk that drew Dr. Carr's attention. Unlike the open shelves, this cabinet had doors fitted with a substantial lock. "Hold the light steady," Dr. Carr said. The lock proved more difficult than the door above. Dr. Carr's hands were steady from years of surgical work, but the mechanism was better made than he had expected. Sweat gathered at his temples despite the cool air. Finally, something clicked. The cabinet doors swung open. Inside were envelopes, 34 of them, arranged in chronological order, each bearing a name written in Reverend Ashford's distinctive hand. Dr. Carr lifted the first envelope carefully. The name read, Jonathan Fletcher. The date written beneath was February 16th, 1861. He opened it. The letter inside was written on good paper in a hand that trembled with age or illness. My final confession, witnessed this day by Reverend Marcus Ashford. I have kept silent for 40 years about the fire at the warehouse. I said it. The insurance money saved the business, but Samuel Thompson died in that fire. I have carried this knowledge to my death. May God have mercy on my soul. The signature was Jonathan Fletcher's. Beneath it, Reverend Ashford had added his own signature as witness. Dr. Carr opened the next envelope, and the next. Each contained a similar document: final confessions, deathbed statements, admissions of adultery, theft, fraud, abandonment. The intimate sins that men and women whispered to their clergy when death approached and earthly consequences no longer mattered. 34 envelopes. 34 secrets that should have remained sealed by pastoral confidence. Dear God, James Hewitt breathed. But there was more. Tucked inside several of the more recent envelopes were small slips of paper, the kind used by telegraph operators to transcribe incoming messages. Dr. Carr unfolded one dated March 10th. The text was brief and cryptic. Merchandise age 6 suitable for sensitive contracts. Demonstrate skills. Inquiries from 2 clients. Advise timeline. It was signed with initials. M.A. Marcus Ashford. Another slip, dated March 11th, bore a different hand. Interested party offering £200. Display arranged Friday evening. Prepare departure documents. This one was signed C.H. Boston. Dr. Carr read both messages twice, then looked at Hewitt. The younger man's face had gone pale in the lantern light. "They're selling the children," Hewitt said. Dr. Carr returned to the cabinet and began methodically removing envelopes, cross-referencing names with dates. Jonathan Fletcher had died February 18th. Thomas had recited Fletcher's final words on the same day. Silas Hewitt's name appeared on an envelope dated March 1st, 3 days after his drowning. The confession inside described the missing £40 and expressed regret about a confrontation with Reverend Ashford regarding financial irregularities in the charitable trust. My father confronted Ashford about missing funds, James Hewitt said, reading over Dr. Carr's shoulder. And 3 days later, he drowned. This wasn't an accident. The pattern was now visible in its entirety. Reverend Ashford had been using his position to collect deathbed confessions, documenting secrets that would normally die with their speakers. He had then coached Thomas Merrick, feeding him these confessions word by word, training the boy to repeat them as though receiving supernatural knowledge. The purpose was demonstration, proof of concept. Thomas was being prepared for sale to clients who would use a child capable of revealing secrets as a tool for blackmail and extortion. Dr. Carr moved to the desk and opened its drawers. Inside the bottom drawer, he found a ledger, its pages filled with entries that documented transactions spanning 3 years. Names of children, ages, dates of transfer, sums received. 9 children from St. Bartholomew's alone, sold to buyers in Boston, Portland, New York. The amounts ranged from £150 to £250 depending on what the ledger described as demonstrated capabilities. The affiliated institutions were not charitable organizations. They were way stations in a trafficking network that spanned New England. And Thomas Merrick, the boy who spoke secrets no one should know, was simply the latest product being prepared for market. His gift was not supernatural. It was manufactured through exploitation and trauma. His ability to mimic coached information transformed into a commodity for sale to men who dealt in leverage and ruin. Friday evening, Dr. Carr said, his voice flat. That's when the display is arranged. Ashford intends to demonstrate Thomas to potential buyers. Then, we inform the constable, Hewitt said. We bring this evidence to the authorities. Dr. Carr considered this. Constable Morrison was 63 years old, appointed by the parish council, loyal to the church. But the mill owners held influence of their own, and James Hewitt's family had weight in. Millbrooks divided society. More importantly, time was running out. If they moved through official channels, Ashford might be warned. The Friday display might be canceled. Thomas might disappear into the network before justice could intervene. We let Friday happen, Dr. Carr said, but we ensure there are witnesses the church cannot silence. They spent another hour documenting what they had found, copying names and dates and transaction amounts by the light of Hewitt's lantern. The telegraph slips they took entire, evidence too specific to reproduce by hand. When they finally ascended the stairs and emerged into the cold night air, Dr. Carr locked the basement door behind them, leaving no sign they had been there. Above them, clouds had begun to break apart, revealing stars that seemed impossibly distant and indifferent to what transpired in the darkness below. The next morning, the 16th of March, Dr. Carr received a summons from Reverend Ashford. The note was brief and courteous, requesting that Dr. Carr attend a meeting at the church that evening to discuss his medical findings regarding Thomas Merrick prior to the parish council's Friday session. The timing was not coincidental. Ashford was moving to control the narrative, to establish the official explanation before Dr. Carr could present evidence of criminal activity. Dr. Carr sent his reply accepting the invitation. Then he walked to the mill and met with James Hewitt and 2 of the mill's senior managers, men whose unionist politics made them natural opponents of the church's authority. He showed them copies of what he had found. He explained what Thomas Merrick actually represented, and he asked them to be present Friday evening, hidden but ready to bear witness. By noon, Constable Morrison had been pressured by mill owner influence to attend as well, though what he had been told remained deliberately incomplete. That afternoon, Dr. Carr returned to St. Bartholomew's. He found Matron Whitmore in her office and asked her directly about the prayer sessions, about the children who had been transferred, about the transactions she must have witnessed. She looked at him for a long moment, her face expressionless. Then she began to speak, and what she said confirmed every terrible suspicion he had formed. Matron Whitmore sat perfectly still in her office chair, her hands folded on the desk before her, and told Dr. Carr what she had been willing herself not to see for 3 years. The episodes occurred 2 or 3 times each week, always during evening meal when all the children were gathered. Thomas would become very still, his eyes losing focus, as though he had departed his body and left only a vessel behind. Then he would speak in voices that did not belong to a 6-year-old child. The cadence would shift. The mannerisms would change. He would use words no boy his age should know, and describe events he could not possibly have witnessed. The pattern had started only after Reverend Ashford began the private prayer sessions. These took place in the church basement twice weekly, always behind a locked door, always with only the Reverend and the child present. Ashford had explained this as necessary for spiritual counseling, claiming that Thomas responded better without the distraction of others. Matron Whitmore had accepted this explanation because accepting it allowed her to continue her employment, to maintain the fiction that St. Bartholomew's was what it claimed to be. The children who were transferred, Dr. Carr said. Where did they go? Matron Whitmore's voice remained steady, but something in her eyes had changed. I was told they went to better situations, families who wanted to adopt, institutions with more resources. Reverend Ashford handled all the arrangements. I was only required to prepare the children for departure and record the transfers in the ledger. Did families ever write? Did anyone ever inquire about the transferred children? No. And this did not trouble you? She looked at him for a long moment. I am a widow, Dr. Carr. I have been employed here since 1858. This position provides my only income. When one is dependent on an institution for survival, one learns not to ask questions that might threaten that survival. Dr. Carr understood this logic, even as it repulsed him. How many ordinary people participated in extraordinary evil, simply by choosing not to see what stood directly before them? How many looked away because looking would cost them something they could not afford to lose? The prayer sessions, he said. Did Thomas ever speak about what occurred during them? He would not speak at all after the sessions. He would return to the dormitory and sit on his bed staring at nothing, sometimes for hours. I assumed Reverend Ashford was helping him work through his grief about his mother. And the other children who had these episodes before Thomas, the ones who were transferred. Did they also attend private prayer sessions? Matron Whitmore nodded slowly. Yes, all of them. Dr. Carr rose from his chair and walked to the window. Outside, the afternoon light was already beginning to fade. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow evening, Reverend Ashford intended to display Thomas to potential buyers, demonstrating the boy's ability to reveal secrets as though receiving them from the dead. The morning after that, Thomas would be transferred to an affiliated institution, and from there, he would disappear into a network that had already consumed at least 9 other children from this orphanage alone. There were 3 deaths recorded in your ledger, Dr. Carr said without turning from the window. Pneumonia, scarlet fever, and drowning. Tell me about the drowning. The silence stretched long enough that he turned to look at her. Matron Whitmore's composure had finally cracked. Her hands trembled against the desk. William Ashby, she said, quietly. Age 8. He drowned in the river in September of 1859. They found his body caught in the roots downstream from the mill. The constable ruled it accidental. Boys sometimes went to the river to fish without permission. But William was terrified of water. He would not bathe without crying. He had nearly drowned as an infant. Everyone at the orphanage knew this. The idea that he would go to the river alone made no sense. Was William one of the children who attended private prayer sessions? Yes. He had been demonstrating abilities similar to Thomas's. Then, 1 week before the drowning, he stopped speaking entirely. Reverend Ashford said the boy was proving unsuitable for placement and would need to be transferred to a different type of institution. Then William died, and the matter was closed. Dr. Carr felt the pattern expanding, revealing depths he had not yet imagined. Children who demonstrated the required abilities were sold. Children who failed or refused were eliminated. The system had a ruthless efficiency that suggested years of refinement. And at its center sat Reverend Marcus Ashford, collecting deathbed confessions and coaching traumatized children and maintaining ledgers that documented transactions as calmly as a shopkeeper recording the sale of cloth or grain. "I need you to tell this to Constable Morrison," Dr. Carr said. "Tomorrow evening, when witnesses are present." "They will dismiss me," Matron Whitmore said. "I will have no position, no income, no reference for future employment." "You will have your conscience," she laughed, a single bitter sound. "Conscience does not pay for lodging or food, Dr. Carr. Conscience is a luxury for those who can afford it." He left her there and returned to his own house as dusk settled over Millbrook. That evening, he wrote a detailed account of everything he had discovered, documenting the confession letters, the telegraph messages, the ledger entries, Matron Whitmore's testimony. He sealed this account in an envelope addressed to the district attorney in Boston and left it on his desk with instructions that it be mailed if anything should happen to prevent him from attending Friday's meeting. Friday arrived with cold rain that drummed against windows and turned the unpaved streets to mud. Dr. Carr spent the morning reviewing his notes and the afternoon ensuring that James Hewitt and the mill managers understood their roles. Constable Morrison had been told only that there were serious irregularities at St. Bartholomew's requiring official witness. The full scope of the conspiracy would be revealed during the display itself, when Ashford's intentions could not be denied. At 7 o'clock that evening, Dr. Carr arrived at the church basement. Reverend Ashford was already there, standing beside his desk with 3 well-dressed men from Boston. The men wore expensive coats and carried themselves with the assured manner of those accustomed to getting what they paid for. One was introduced as a lawyer, another as a businessman with interests in shipping. The third offered no profession, only a cold smile and eyes that assessed Dr. Carr as though calculating his value for resale. Thomas Merrick sat on a wooden chair in the center of the room, wearing clothes that had been cleaned and pressed for the occasion. His face was expressionless. Matron Whitmore stood near the stairs, her posture rigid. And in the shadows beyond the lantern light, hidden in the alcove where communion silver was stored, James Hewitt and Constable Morrison waited, with 2 mill managers as witnesses to what was about to unfold. Reverend Ashford smiled and gestured toward the child. "Gentlemen, if you would care to test the boy's abilities, I assure you that you will find them quite genuine. Ask him about any deceased person of your acquaintance. He will reveal knowledge that only the dead could possess." The lawyer stepped forward. "My father died last month. Ask him about my father." Reverend Ashford leaned down and whispered something in Thomas's ear, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. Thomas remained perfectly still for several seconds. Then he opened his mouth to speak, and what emerged was not the coached revelation Ashford had prepared. Instead, Thomas turned his head and looked directly at Dr. Carr. "Dr. Carr says there are roses in heaven," the boy said in his own clear voice. "Dr. Carr says I don't have to do the scary game anymore. Dr. Carr says the angels know what you did to those other children, and they're very angry." The room went silent. Reverend Ashford's hand tightened on Thomas's shoulder. The 3 men from Boston exchanged glances, and from the shadows, Constable Morrison stepped forward into the light, followed by the mill managers and James Hewitt, all of them emerging as witnesses to a crime that could no longer be denied or explained away. 5 years later, in March of 1866, a state inspector named Robert Fielding sat in a quiet office at the Massachusetts State Archive, reviewing case files that had accumulated during the war years. The nation was attempting to rebuild itself. The mills of New England were running at capacity, producing fabric for a reunited country that needed everything from bedsheets to flags. But among the administrative debris of those chaotic years were documents that told stories the Commonwealth had not yet fully processed. The St. Bartholomew's case was one of these. Fielding opened the file and found Dr. Samuel Carr's final report, dated April of 1861, typed on official court stationery but never published in full. The doctor had been thorough. 11 pages documented the confession letters found in Reverend Ashford's cabinet, the telegraph records showing coordination across 5 cities, the ledger entries recording transactions that treated children as inventory. Attached to the report were witness statements from Constable Morrison, Matron Eugenia Whitmore, James Hewitt, and 3 mill managers who had been present in the church basement on the evening of March 16th. The arrest had been immediate. Reverend Marcus Ashford had attempted to flee, but was apprehended before reaching the street. The 3 men from Boston had been detained for questioning. One proved to be legitimate, a lawyer who claimed he had come to investigate spiritualist claims after hearing rumors of a gifted child. The other 2 were documented criminals with connections to brothels and criminal apprenticeship operations in Boston and New York. They testified in exchange for reduced sentences, providing names and locations that allowed authorities to trace the network's full extent. Fielding turned to the inventory of recovered children. 11 of the 9 originally listed as missing from St. Bartholomew's had been found alive, though what they had endured in the interim was documented only in the sparse language of official reports. 4 had been located in Canadian establishments that the documents described as brothels. 3 were working in New York criminal operations, trained as pickpockets and confidence artists. 2 had been traced to textile factories using falsified ages that made them appear older than their actual years. 2 remained unaccounted for, their fates unknown and likely unknowable, given the time that had elapsed and the lack of comprehensive records. The scope extended far beyond Millbrook. Telegraph records and testimony from the arrested conspirators revealed a network spanning New England. 67 children over 6 years. 12 co-conspirators operating across Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, and New York. Estimated total transactions of £4,000. The horror lay not in its supernatural elements, which proved entirely absent, but in its banal efficiency. Children were resources to be assessed, trained, and sold. Deathbed confessions were intelligence to be weaponized. Trust and grief and institutional authority were tools for exploitation. Thomas Merrick had been removed from St. Bartholomew's on the night of March 16, 1861, by court order granting temporary custody to Dr. Carr. A psychiatric evaluation conducted 3 weeks later described a boy who spoke normally when unprompted, but exhibited dissociative responses when placed in environments resembling Reverend Ashford's training sessions. The evaluating physician theorized that Thomas had been conditioned through repeated trauma to enter a suggestible state, during which he could reproduce coached information with remarkable accuracy. Whether Thomas had ever truly possessed supernatural knowledge remained, in the physician's carefully worded conclusion, a question that medical science could neither confirm nor disprove with certainty. Fielding found this assessment both honest and unsettling. The case file included several instances where Thomas's revelations had proven accurate beyond what coaching could easily explain. The detail about Dr. Carr's wife Sarah, the exact number of times Silas Hewitt had called for his wife Margaret, the call mentioned in Mrs. Good's stillbirth. Either Reverend Ashford had access to information sources more comprehensive than investigators had discovered, or something else had occurred that transcended simple fraud. The file preserved this ambiguity without attempting to resolve it. Reverend Marcus Ashford had died in prison in October of 1863, before the full network could be exposed. The cause of death was recorded as pneumonia, though a note in the margins suggested complications from injuries sustained during an altercation with other inmates. 3 members of the St. Bartholomew's Parish Council had been charged with conspiracy and fraud. 2 had fled Massachusetts before trial. One had taken his own life. The others claimed ignorance of Ashford's activities, and without the Reverend's testimony to contradict them, prosecutors had insufficient evidence to proceed. Matron Eugenia Whitmore had been dismissed from St. Bartholomew's immediately following her testimony. She had provided a written statement admitting that she had prepared children for Ashford's training sessions, that she had suspected the transferred children were not going to legitimate placements, and that she had deliberately avoided asking questions that might force her to confront what was happening. She had not been charged criminally, but her confession had made her unemployable in any charitable institution. The last record of her appeared in an 1862 census, listing her as a seamstress in a boarding house in Springfield. Fielding turned to the final section of Dr. Carr's report, a handwritten addendum dated 1875, added long after the official investigation had closed. The doctor's handwriting showed the slight tremor of age, but his thoughts remained clear. I have spent 14 years asking whether Thomas truly spoke Sarah's words, or whether grief made me believe what I needed to hear. I no longer seek that answer. What I know with certainty is this: evil does not require the supernatural. It requires only our willingness to look away. We looked away from 9 children who disappeared into affiliated institutions that kept no addresses. We looked away from 3 deaths that were too convenient to be coincidental. We looked away because looking would have cost us something we were not prepared to pay. The question is not whether Thomas Merrick possessed genuine gifts. The question is how many other children suffer while we debate the nature of mysteries, instead of confronting the banality of cruelty. The St. Bartholomew's case had prompted legislative action. Massachusetts had passed a Child Protection Act in 1867, requiring monthly inspections of all charitable institutions housing minors. Telegraph. Companies had implemented message logging protocols for criminal investigations. Foundling hospitals had begun using fingerprinting systems to track children through institutional transfers. Church control of orphanages had been replaced by secular oversight across the Commonwealth. These were concrete changes, measurable reforms. But Fielding knew from reading case files that reforms only worked when people chose to enforce them. He closed the file and looked at the final document, a photograph taken in 1870 that someone had attached to the folder years after the case had closed. It showed an empty room with 14 small beds arranged along 2 walls. The caption beneath read, "St. Bartholomew's Dormitory, after closure, March 1861. The beds were neatly made. The floorboards were clean. Nothing in the image suggested what had occurred there. It looked like any institutional room, functional and spare, the kind of space that existed in hundreds of orphanages across the nation. But Fielding had read the testimony. He knew that children had sat in that room and been coached to speak words they did not understand, revealing secrets that would be used to destroy lives, all so they could be sold to the highest bidder. He knew that some of those children had died when they proved unsuitable for sale. He knew that the adults responsible had maintained careful records and conducted their business with the calm efficiency of shopkeepers managing inventory. Thomas Merrick had lived. Dr. Carr's report included a final notation stating that Thomas had been formally adopted in 1862, had attended school, had shown no lasting signs of the trauma he had endured, and had asked never to speak publicly about 1861. The boy was 72 years old now, assuming he still lived. An old man who had once been weaponized as a child. The file did not say whether he remembered what had been done to him, or whether that kind of trauma ever truly faded, or whether the roses Dr. Carr's dead wife had mentioned were real, or simply words a grieving man had needed to hear.